Hello and welcome back. This is Dawn with another video for Picket Studios. So today we're going to do two things. We're going to get some watercolor practice in, and we're going to create some last minute gift ideas. So for this, I'm using the Soft Landing stamp set. This is a great little stamp set filled with all of these hot air balloons, and it's perfect for practicing our watercolor. So I've already stamped this in a light brown waterproof ink on 100% cotton watercolor paper. I'll have everything linked below. But this is going to be perfect to create some bookmarks. Bookmarks are 2 by 6, I think is the standard size. So I've cut my panel here to 8 inches by 6 inches. I'm going to start by putting in my sky in the background. Now I've got a pretty large brush here. I believe I grabbed a size 10 round brush, and I'm using just clean water here to wet the background of my paper. I'm going around the balloons, but I'm not being overly careful. This is going to be such a light wash. I don't want the paper to be sopping wet, but I want it to be wet. I want there to be a nice sheen on the paper, but I don't want puddles of water on the paper. So I'm going through and I'm just laying down a wash of clean water across the background. Don't worry if you skip some spots. Actually, that's preferred. That'll end up looking like clouds in the sky. So I just kind of roughly go in here and I'm wetting about 7/8 of the paper. I'm going to leave the bottom dry because I'm going to put a tree line in there. And once I've got the background wet, I can go ahead and start dropping in my color. So I'm mixing up a little bit of ultramarine blue here on my palette, and I'm going to start dropping that into the background here. And because that paper is nice and wet, this is going to start spreading on its own. It's everywhere the paper is wet, that pigment is going to flow. And it's going to spread out nice and soft. So you can see here I am not completely covering everything. I'm just kind of dropping in some color, leaving some gaps because, again, that pigment will travel towards each other wherever the paper's wet. And I want to work pretty quickly here because I don't want my paper to dry. So this is a great exercise for working quickly. You know you're on a time limit here. You want your paper to stay wet long enough to create those soft blooms and transitions of the color, so it kind of keeps you from getting too caught up in working in any details. Here you can see I've just mixed in, there was a little bit of palette mud there in my palette, some purple off to the side, so I just mixed that in, and I'm going to drop that in a couple of places as well, and that's just going to give me some variation in the blues in the sky here. Now today I'm going to go for that storybook look. It's one of my favorite watercolor looks. Think of like illustrated children's books from back in the day. I just really love that soft look. And that is why I've stamped in one waterproof ink, and it's a little bit darker. Normally I always use antique linen distress ink when I'm doing no line watercoloring, but again this time I'm going to do that storybook look, which includes the outlines a lot of times, so I didn't want to lose my lines, which is why I went with a little bit of a darker brown and a waterproof ink. Now once our sky is all filled in, and while the paper is still a little bit damp, I'm going to go ahead and put in that tree line. I'm not worried if there's a little bit of seepage of the green into the sky. In fact, I kind of prefer that. It can soften up those edges, which will make the back line of the trees appear further away. They'll be a little bit blurred, not as in focus. So don't worry if your paper's still a little bit damp. Just go ahead and start blotting in your trees. You can see I'm still using that same large number 10 round brush, and I've taken some sap green, and I'm just what I like to call kind of scumbling, laying the brush almost on its side, more about probably a 35-degree angle, and I'm just sliding the brush across in some areas and then just dabbing it in others. Once I've got that base down, I'm leaving some white gaps in there. That's perfect. I'm going to go ahead and grab a little bit more of that sap green and mix it in with some of this other darker green that's on my palette, and then repeat the same thing. I'm just going to kind of slide my brush across the paper in some areas and then just tap it in others. Again, I'm not filling the entire bottom. I'm just tapping in some color so that these two different greens will mix together, and I will get a kind of like a depth of field here. Colors that are further away from you are less saturated, and colors that are closer to you are more vibrant. So this is going to look like we have different levels, different depths of trees. And because this is a sky view, we're only worried about the very tops of the trees, so we don't have to worry about any trunks or stems, anything of that nature. All right, we're going to let this dry 100%, and then we can come in and paint the watercolor balloons. Now we're going to keep this very simple, very beginner friendly. All of these techniques are very easy, but some of them do take a little bit of practice. Water control is the most important thing in watercolor, so these are great ways to practice your water control. Using that wet wash in the background and then dropping our color in will teach us a lot about how strong to make our pigment when we drop it into that wet background, depending on how dark or light we want it to be when it dries back. So the more water that you introduce, the lighter it's going to dry back, and the heavier the pigment load, so the less water you mix into the paint, the darker it's going to dry and the less it's going to spread. So that's one thing to observe when you're doing that background wash for your sky. Play around with different water to pigment ratios when you're dropping in your paint. Now, I've picked a very simplified color palette. All of my balloons are going to be a combination of red, yellow, green, or turquoise. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting each section of the balloon individually. Now, if the entire balloon is one solid color, you can most definitely paint in a light wash of that color over the entire balloon, let it dry, and then come in and add another layer of shadow, or you can paint section by section. So I think that for beginners, painting section by section and not allowing two wet areas to touch is going to be the easiest for learning, because you don't have to worry about those two wet sections bleeding into each other. Now, this particular balloon is going to be all red on the bottom, but for demonstration purposes, I went ahead and am painting these section by section. I'm imagining that my light source is in the upper right-hand corner, so each section is going to be brighter on the right side and shadowed on the left side. This is going to create those rounded sections. So instead of the hot air balloon being one whole round unit as one, each section is going to have its own highlights and shadows. So I'm going to do the same thing for every hot air balloon. I'm going to start by laying down a light wash of that color. I'm going to leave some white or some bright highlights towards the right side of each section, even leaving some white paper showing where I put no paint on them in some areas. And then I'm going to add a little bit more darker or more concentrated color towards the bottom and towards the left side. Again, this is going to lay in the foundation for those shadows. And I'm not trying to get all of my shadows in at this point. This is just the first layer, so I'm just getting a good base layer down. You'll also notice that because we're working in smaller areas here, I've switched to a much smaller brush. This is a size 1 round brush, so it allows me to control how much color and how much water I'm putting down at once. You should always match the size of your brush to the size of your project. So larger projects or larger areas, use a larger brush. Smaller areas, use a smaller brush. And this is going to be a very repetitive process for all of the balloons, but it is great practice. Repetition is great practice. So I'm going to put down a little bit of color where I know that my areas are going to be darkest. Then I'm going to use my damp brush to move that color around. So put down a little bit of dark color, rinse my brush, blot it off on a paper towel, and then use that damp brush to pull the color into the lighter areas. And we're going to repeat that over and over for each section. That repetition is really important in building not only technical memory of the technique, but muscle memory as well. So I highly recommend projects like this where you're doing the same thing over and over for beginners. It's just a great way to learn. All right, now once the balloons, that first layer is done for all the balloons, I can come in and do the basket. For that, I'm just adding a little swipe of burnt sienna. You can see here, picking up a little burnt sienna, doing a little swipe on each basket. And then for just a little extra detail, I'm going to switch over to a 3/10 brush. Now this is a tiny brush, but it will allow me to drop just the ittiest bittiest amount of a very concentrated burnt sienna to the left side of the basket. And because that base is wet, it'll carry that darker color and create a gradual dark to light. And it's the tiniest little detail, but it makes a difference. And then I'm also going to use that same brush here to paint the stripes on this hot air balloon right here. These stripes are really, really tiny. So I'm going to use that 3/10 brush here to just paint in some red stripes. Now, if you don't have a smaller brush like this, you could always use a marker here to put these in afterwards. It is a very small area, so don't fret. There's always a way to use what we have to achieve our end goal. All right, so once that first layer is completely dry, we can come in and start adding in some of our shadows or bulking up our color a little bit. We'll use the exact same colors, except for this time we'll use a little less water in our mix, and that'll make the color just a little more concentrated. So like I said before, my light source, I'm imagining it being in the upper right-hand corner. So for each segment, I am choosing where the shadow is going to fall, and I'm adding another layer of color there. Now, the great thing about the storybook style is I don't really have to overthink this. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate. We're not going for photorealism. We're going for storybook illustration. So as long as you're giving the general idea in a couple spots of where the light source is, you'll be fine. So for each segment, I'm just adding in a little bit more pigmented color here, just to suggest where shadows would be. And with this style, really less is more, because we are going to come in and we're going to add outlines anyway. So don't worry about going overboard or, again, getting your shadows completely accurate. It's not that big of a deal. Here, we're just using this to learn and to have a little fun. So when I first saw this stamp set, it was like a core memory was unlocked. I don't know if you guys have ever had this experience. It usually happens with, like, you smell a certain smell or you hear a song or something like that. For me, it was the imagery in the stamp set. When I was younger, maybe 10, 11, we lived in Monterey, California, and they had these hot air balloon races. I believe they were called the Hot Air Affair, and we used to go to those. I seem to remember possibly my mom and my stepdad at the time actually going up in the hot air balloons at one point. But it was just one of those memories that I had forgotten about, that I hadn't thought about in a really long time. But when I saw this particular stamp set, it was, again, like core memory unlocked. So I thought, what if I just used all of the stamps to create this, to recreate that hot air affair, those hot air balloon races. And I knew that the storybook look would work perfectly with it. And then if we cut them up into bookmarks, we get to double them as a great little gift addition. So like if you have any avid readers in your life, a bookmark with a gift certificate or a gift card to their favorite bookstore, along with maybe a mug, would be a great gift. It's a gift cards can be impersonal, but this way you get to gift a little something personal with it. And I think it just really makes it even more special. Okay, so now that we've done the second layer on the balloons, we can do the same thing to our treetops here. You don't need to do much. We're just going to add a little bit of more defined color here. And again, this is going to help separate some of these trees. Right now, everything dried back very soft, and they all kind of merged into each other, which is beautiful. But we do want to pick just a few areas to push some of these bushes or trees to the background and make some of those lighter areas come forward just by adding a little bit of hard color to some of the areas. So these will dry back with a harder, crisper edge. It's going to add just the littlest bit of detail to these to this tree line, and it's really going to make a huge difference. You don't have to do much. Again, just tapping a little bit of color here and there, and I'm not even going to bother with blending out much of this. Just couple little taps with the brush, and instantly we have the suggestion of some more defined treetops here. This final step is optional, and there's a couple different ways you could do it. For me, again, I want that storybook look, so I've picked up a little bit of Van Dyke Brown here, or you could use burnt umber, and again, I'm using that 3/10 brush. And I am going to just trace over portions of the stamping here. I'm allowing my brush to skip so that I don't get a solid tracing of the image. I don't want it to look too hard. I don't want it to look boldly outlined. That's a good word for it. I just want to come in here and go over some of these lines and deepen it up in some areas to provide some contrast from the stamping color. And again, that's why I stamped it in a darker color than I normally would for no line watercolor, because I wanted those stamped lines to show through at the end. So here I'm just going to take that tiny little brush and I'm just going to trace over some areas of the stamping. Now, If you don't have this tiny brush, you could use a fine liner pen. If you wanted to keep in with the storybook look, you could use a brown fine liner, but you could also use a black fine liner, and then that's going to give you a bolder contrast, and it's going to have that like ink and wash look, which is another watercolor look that I really love. And I think either would look great depending on what you have on hand. All right, so I went ahead and did that for all of our hot air balloons, and now we need to do something about this tree line because we want it to match with the hot water balloons, the hot air balloons. So we're going to do the same thing for our tree line. I've taken that Van Dyke Brown, again, that 3/10 brush, and we are going to create an outline. I'm just going to squiggle along the edges of the color here. You can see that literally squiggle lines, following the outline of where the paint stops, and I'm not doing a full complete line. I'm including lots of breaks, and I'm going to leave some areas untouched. Again, we're adding the suggestion of breaks in the treetops here where one tree might start and another might end. So keep it loose. Keep it lighter towards the back of the tree line, and then pick up more paint and make it a little bit darker over the darker areas. So very, very easy to do, very simple, but it is also very easy to go overboard here. Try to refrain from outlining every single thing. Try to keep it a little sporadic and a little loose. The good thing is this brush, because it's so tiny, doesn't hold much paint. So it's going to require you to reload. Take that as your cue to create a break. Like stop where you were, go to a different section, and then add a couple more squiggles. So you'll notice that every time I reload my brush, I kind of just go to a different area on the tree line there, and it's a good way to keep from overdoing it. All right, so this is going to be the hard part for some of us. We're going to cut this up now, and I'm going to pay no regard for where things ended and where they began. I'm going to make 4 bookmarks out of this, so I'm going to cut this every 2 inches. I'm going to start from the edge and just cut. Now, you're going to be tempted to try to pick out areas, but if you want to get the most out of this, just be fearless and cut it every 2 inches. We're going to add a stamped sentiment to this, and we're going to paint in some little birds. So if there's any weird bare spots, they're going to work fine. Don't worry about it. Trust me. Just trust the process. So I chose the I adore your brave heart sentiment that's in the stamp set. I thought it was just a good one. It's not really a greeting or anything. It's just a nice inspirational saying, and I thought it would be great as a little bookmark affirmation. And I just chose the best open area on each of the 4 and stamped the same sentiment. So as the final step, I decided we still had quite a bit of open area there, and we could add a little bit of life to these bookmarks. So I took that same 3/10 brush and that Van Dyke Brown. I just re-wet it here, and we're just gonna paint in a few little birds. Now, birds are super easy. They're meant to look very far away, so you just do a little M, and then just a little straight line in the middle of that M. That didn't make sense, so watch. 1 curve, 2 curve, and then right there in the middle, we're just going to kind of flatten our brush to extend that, and that looks like the body of the bird. It's a good thing we have visuals here. So I'm going to kind of scatter a few little birds around, and I'm going to make some of them larger and some of them smaller. And then if I want the bird to face the other direction, the little line in the middle of the M, I'll just face it in the other direction. So that'll make the body of the bird look like it's facing the other direction. Again, this is one of those things where you do not want to go overboard. A few birds scattered throughout is more than enough. I usually like to work in odd numbers. So 1 bird, 3 birds, 5 birds. That's a good place to start. All right, so they are pretty much done. From here, I would recommend laminating them. I could not find my lamination sheet, so I'm just going to demonstrate how to finish them off here, but I would highly recommend laminating it first. Then I took my Crop-A-Dile here, and I'm going to create a hole. You saw me almost wing it. I highly recommend that you measure. So here I'm going to put it down on my grid mat, and then I used a pencil just to mark the center point. Now I'm going to take my Crop-A-Dile. For mine, I'm going to use the smaller hole, and then I'm going to use a little grommet here. I'm going to push that through the hole, and then I'll use the Crop-A-Dile to secure the grommet. So I'll just use that middle section there, slide that into the grommet, and then give it a good press, and that's going to secure that grommet. And that helps protect the hole so that it doesn't rip. Now to finish this one off, I used a little tassel here that I made out of DMC floss. I'll just thread that through and tie it in a knot. You can finish this off any way you want. I really, really love creating these. I like that we were able to do one larger painting and then just cut it into bookmarks. Like I said, it's a great way to get that practice in, and it's another fun way to add something personalized when you're giving gift cards. So I really hope that you guys liked today's video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss any future videos. All of the featured products will be listed in the description box below. As always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.